I'm Dean Newland, and welcome to Leadovation. Reimagine, facilitate, flourish. This podcast is dedicated to the art and science of innovative leadership. Through insightful interviews with industry experts, I bring you cutting-edge strategies and experiences of innovative leadership, helping you think differently, act strategically, and achieve remarkable results. Join me as I provide insights and tools that empower you to make smarter decisions, forge meaningful relationships. Welcome to Leadovation. Today's guest is Ashley Jablow, an innovation strategist and facilitator who believes the best leaders don't just solve problems, they design better ways of working, leading, and living. After building her career at IDEO, serving in the Presidential Innovation Fellowship, and helping organizations rethink innovation, Ashley discovered that the same design thinking principles used by the world's leading companies can also transform careers, leadership, and organizational structure. In this conversation, Ashley explains why so many meetings, strategies, and cultures fail before they ever begin, how leaders can become more innovative by embracing healthy risk and experimentation, why constraints actually fuel creativity, and how design thinking can even strengthen intuition and self-trust. So whether you're leading a team, navigating change, or redesigning your own career, you'll walk away with practical ideas you can put into practice immediately. Ashley, it's great to have you on the show today. And I would like to ask if you could explain to our audience something that maybe some don't quite understand. We've heard the term sometimes not, around design thinking. It sounds cool. It sounds like, you pull out your colors and your flip charts and you start thinking almost in terms of architecture. But what is design thinking when it comes to the process of planning and intentionality and being able to work towards something? What does that really mean?
Yeah, it's a great starting question. And thank you, Dean, for having me. I think, I'll admit when I first started working in the field of design thinking, almost 15 years ago now, I was just as confused as everyone else. I remember my first job at IDEO, one of the kind of, the founding places where design thinking really came up in the world, and thinking to myself, like, how did I get here and what exactly do we do here? I felt like I was sort of snuck in through a side door. And it's taken me a number of years to really be able to distill down that answer for you in a way that I think is really just accessible and kind of foundational. So more than anything, design thinking is a process for creative problem solving and for generating new ideas and new solutions that puts people at the center. So rather than saying, you know what, I've got this great idea and I'm just going to take it to market, right? If you're a company, we just really want to make this widget. Rather than jumping to building the widget, design thinking asks us to take a step back and consider, who are the people that we are trying to serve? What is their experience? What problems are they trying to solve? Because it's probably likely that the widget you want to make may not actually speak to the experience that they're living. So design thinking asks you to be creative and innovative, of course, but also deeply empathetic and understanding of the people in the ecosystem you're designing for, and to always keep them at the forefront. And it's interesting because, certainly when I was working in kind of pure innovation, we were always talking about users or customers or kind of that end audience. What I've gotten to do now in my own business is actually help people say, You are your best user, right? You are the person
Mm.
you're designing for. And so you can take the same methods and mindsets of design thinking that you'd use in a Fortune 500 company or in an academic institution or in government, and you can actually apply those same approaches to designing your career and your life.
So the people who are doing the designing would also be the people who would benefit from the design.
When you're turning it kind of inward on yourself, yes, that's very true. Yeah.
Understood. Okay. So, can you give me some examples, let's say in a company where typically we don't see design thinking taking place, but it should?
Oh gosh. I mean, it makes me inhale and kind of steady myself because I think there are a lot of places where
What is there something that
yeah.
I have one that comes up? I mean,
Oh,
maybe I'll prompt you
interesting.
with one idea.
Sure. Yeah.
So, mid-level managers who are, have a team underneath them seem to spend about, 25, 28 hours a week in meetings. Some people would say that's very low, but it's sort of an average based on some research that we found out. Most of the meetings that people go into are not designed, meaning that
Hmm.
we just fall into the meeting. We're on a hamster wheel of this is what we've been doing all the time. We got one person who usually runs the show. Most of the time, it's usually kind of report in on status. And that's about it. That's about the extent of the design, right?
Hmm.
So, what I've noticed is that what's missing often in these meetings is a sense of design, meaning, for example, what do we want to come as a result of this particular conversation? How do we create the environment where we have the optimum amount of engagement? How do we prepare people for their role in the meeting? Are we going to make decisions, or is this just a share of information? Those sort of design thoughts. Like, you would never go to a wedding and just say, well, I suppose you could if you went to Vegas and you just get married, but these are designed events, right? And that they're
Yeah.
very large designed events that take sometimes months or even years, but nonetheless, they are well thought out. That's one example that comes to my mind of a situation where design is often missing that would have a great benefit if it were in place.
I love that example. And I'm smiling because as a facilitator myself, there is nothing that grates on me more than going to a meeting without an agenda and without
Mm.
a plan, right? I'm very hard. It's difficult for me to be facilitated by others because I have that kind of itch of like, why are we here? And what looks different as a result of the conversation we're about to have? So that's a great example. I think the one that I'll build on that, the one that comes to mind for me is actually around employee engagement and like the design of culture. So I think often it's probably more acceptable and kind of commonplace that if a company, for example, is whether it's B2B or B2C, like whoever you're selling to, you probably want to understand who they are and what they need and how you can help them solve their problems. That's both like, sort of product development and marketing 101, right? I
Hmm.
think where organizations often struggle is, again, turning inward and saying, we're also actually designing for our employees' experience. A great example is, it's often like the number of travel mugs that I have been gifted over the years as part of like an employee cultivation, swag bag, right? When in reality, I think what a lot of employees in today's organizations want is actually very intangible, and it needs to be designed intentionally. So I'll talk to team leaders or even HR and talent folks about what their people want. And I think we sometimes gloss over, and it's just easier to gift pizza parties, right? Than it
Hmm.
is to design for the experience that's going to help an employee feel included, feel valued, feel appreciated, even feel like they're being developed, right? So it's really interesting to consider, how can you use a process like design thinking to support you to grow your culture internally?
It's a great point. And when we are designing something, I know from a little bit of experience in this that there is a clarity about what we're designing for. There is a way in which to measure a form of success. We can say this meeting, for example, going back to that prior story that I told, was successful because of these particular metrics. Maybe it was a post meeting survey. But when it comes to culture, this is what I get really into a lot and I find fascinating, is that a lot of people don't have a clear understanding. Number one, what do we really mean by culture? And that we all agree on that definition. And two, how do we measure when a culture is successful or not?
Mhm.
How do you then design? I mean, do you feel that in order to design for culture, you need to clarify what culture is and how to measure its success?
Oh, absolutely. And gosh, isn't that one of like the hardest things to do? It's
Yeah.
funny. I lead free monthly workshop called the Innovative Leadership Salon, and we come together. Anyone's invited. We come together and we talk about topics like change and risk. And in fact, recently we had a session about culture. And I started just simply by asking the attendees, what is culture? How do you define it? And the different answers we got. I mean, it was really incredible to receive all these different definitions and to know that none of them were really wrong, right? But by starting with what even is this? I think then we, of course, like you said, we need to say like, or ask ourselves what matters about this and what changes because of the culture that we want to create. But then also, of course, going back to putting people at the center, what do our employees care about, right? Like, what
Hmm.
do our people want? What kind of culture would bring out their best, right? Not just like the CEO in a corner office saying, like, we believe in XYZ. How can we all design that and define it together?
There's so many things here you're mentioning that we could take days to try to unpack. So let me just
Yeah.
quickly run through a thought or two that you made me think about.
Sure.
What we have defined culture is, after a lot of time thinking about this, is that it's how things get done, fueled by vision, values, behaviors, and process. And I
Mm.
think it probably was inspired by some work we've done with clients and maybe the Baldrige Award definition, and we kind of morphed it. And the reason why I like that particular definition is that it blends two parts of the business: the operation side, how things get done, process, so forth, and the human side, values, vision, behaviors. Because when we have a definition that separates culture from the business, then we don't have to put attention to culture when the business is doing poorly. We
Mhm.
somehow create a silo between those two
Mhm.
halves. So I think it's really, in my mind, important that one lands on what the definition of culture is. The thing that I'm also finding it's a struggle is, how do we define when culture is successful? We do a lot of work with healthcare, and I've asked healthcare executives and also people who run their human resource departments. And when you ask them, how do you measure the quality of your culture? And if it's not just a employee engagement score, which does some effect at being able to measure culture, but when you have so many different variables that are coming into play, it's no wonder that we don't put attention to it, because we don't know how to measure it.
Yeah.
So what's your thoughts about all that?
Oh gosh. Well, if I knew the answer, Dean, I think I would be a very wealthy and in demand professional, right? Um, if there were one singular answer for sure. I think the thing I come back to, and I remember this particularly when I worked in the federal government after leaving IDEO. I had the really rare and awesome opportunity to essentially serve as like an innovator in residence in the federal government.
Hmm.
And we were there to talk about the fellowship I was a part of was called the Presidential Innovation Fellowship Program. It was started by the Obama administration. It was just an incredible experience. And we were there to talk about, I want to say like hard hitting topics in air quotes, right? Like technology and data and innovation and like real impact, real service for the American public. And after 2 years of serving at the National Archives, at the Environmental Protection Agency, and even in working with the White House directly, what I realized is that humans are really messy. Like people are just
Yeah.
really complex, like, unique and again, messy, even kind of chaotic beings, right? And so even when you have like the best strategy, right? Even when you know your operations and your process from start to finish with your eyes closed, we humans are going to make things complicated, right? And so what I learned in that experience was it didn't actually matter what we were working on. We were all change management consultants, right? Like we were
Hmm.
all there to help people get comfortable with change, with doing things differently, with even being open and curious as like our starting foundation. And
Hmm.
all of that goes into culture design, right? It's just remembering that, like, it's hard for a reason because people are confusing.
So I listen, I am totally there with you 100%. So let me play a little devil's advocate piece here. Let's
Sure,
assuming that I'm
sure.
somebody else and I don't have the background that you and I have. And I listen to this and I go like, "Oh my gosh. I mean, come on, Ashley. I got budgets. I've got, 5 people I got to rehire. I got timelines I'm supposed to meet that I am going to be judged on. My bonus is going to be affecting my, my financial wherewithal if I make or don't make this. Sounds like spending time on design and culture is really hard because there's no clear way in which to do it. And so I might as well just go back to what I know how to do. Command and control. You guys do this. I will oversee your work. I really don't have time to develop you. We don't really have time to do culture because it's just gosh darn too messy. And I do know that if we're telling the truth, people will probably say, yeah, that's right, right? Because I just don't have the time to do this. This is an investment in something that we don't know when the dividends will pay, or even if we will see the dividends at all, because it may be that we've affected culture, but we don't know about how, right? There's no
Mhm.
feedback loop that gets back to said manager, hey, guess what? This worked, right? So, how do you address that when it comes to designing cultures or even say someone's life when it comes to a career change? How do you do that when the outcomes are not guaranteed?
Hmm. It is the $1 million question, and let's face it. I mean, you're not wrong, Dean, to say that pausing to take a more intentional, thoughtful, creative, and yes, even riskier path than what is known, right? It can feel like you're wasting time. It can feel like like certainly I don't have time for this. And I would say I've got a couple of responses to that. So from a business standpoint, there is data and research shows that companies that are design led, you could call like design and innovation focused, actually outperform their peers not necessarily just in the good times, but particularly in the down times. So like
Hmm.
looking at how the S&P 500 performed during COVID, right? The companies that were design led during those times actually weathered that storm better than their peers who were not. So there's data that shows that working this way supports the business for sure. I think the thing that I really encourage leaders to consider, whether it's leaders of their teams or leaders in our own lives, is really what is the vision we're working towards. And in companies, my experience coaching leaders is everyone is moving so fast, right? Dean, you said people are spending 25 plus hours in meetings, right? I work with leaders who literally don't have time to go to the bathroom because they're in meetings all day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things are moving so quickly. And as a leader, your responsibility, and I would argue your opportunity, is to always have your eye on, well, where are we going? Right. And you can race through your work week with no intentionality, with no sense of what is my vision, what are our goals, and you know your work will sort of take over, right? You're not going to get anywhere. What design thinking, what innovation principles and practices ask you to do, we call it going slow to go fast, right? Because when
Hence
you
the name of the
race,
book.
yeah, there you
Yeah.
go. When you race through your week without that end vision in mind, I can almost guarantee you're going to get 90% of the way and things are going to blow up,
So Ashley,
right?
so are you
Yeah.
saying that you mentioned the S&P 500 being an indication that companies during COVID who were design led did better than those that were not?
Mm,
One could say, all right, what was the difference between those companies? Because I'm sure a company who was not successful during COVID would argue to say, hey, we've been focused on goals and we've been trying to keep our employees happy during a difficult time, whereas the others are somehow doing better. Is the difference in its most simplistic way, or one of the differences, proactivity versus reactivity?
mm.
Is that a component of a design thinking company that's more proactive further down the calendar versus just putting out today's fire?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I'm nodding my head for sure.
Okay.
I think I would yes and that, Dean. So
All
I
right.
do think taking a proactive approach really makes a difference. Like we don't want to, put our head in the sand like an ostrich and just pretend nothing's happening, right? I think the companies that do the best, quote unquote, that perform the best, that have the most engaged workforce, the people who love to go to work, right?
Hmm.
But also in our lives, those of us who achieve the dreams that we set out for ourselves, I think they do two things really well. I think first, they have reframed their relationship with risk. There's this sense that risk is asking me to jump out of an airplane without a parachute, right? And there's a reason why we have an aversion to that kind of risk. But the reality is, in order to innovate, we have to become comfortable with healthy kinds of risks, productive risks, right? The kind that ask us to put ourselves out there, to be brave, to even be vulnerable, to try things, right? So I think the best innovators are those who have reframed their relationship with risk. And second, I think they are people who have learned to iterate. So,
Hmm.
this is going to be hard for all of our perfectionists out there. I'm a recovering one myself, so I can speak from experience. But the idea that I am going to put my head down and just work quietly on something from start to finish, and I will emerge when it's perfectly, formed and done. Newsflash is that's not going to work, right? So the best innovators are the ones who say, I'm going to try something. right? It is going to be a risk, but I'm going to try it in service of learning what works and what doesn't. And once I've learned what works and what doesn't, I'm going to take that and turn that into the next experiment, the next trial, the next risk. So I mean, it's funny again, because I'm a perfectionist through and through. I used to hate working like this. But now I really believe that absolutely everything should be and can be prototyped and iterated upon. And it helps you build confidence along the way.
So bringing this back to culture, and people, and engagement,
Yeah.
you kind of mentioned these two different ways of going about, like, say, designing a product. You've got agile in one hand, which is what you're defining as more iterative, waterfall being more, we're going to present out our, minimal viable product, but it's ready to go, right? It's done pretty much, right? Those are two different styles of approach.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying the agile iterative is now, in this day and age, a little bit more important to lean into. And you also mentioned risk is something that we need to reframe as a learning opportunity, which I love. And on top of that, rhetorical question here, Ashley, does that not require a culture of high trust? Because if I've got a low trust culture where the risk of talking to people is already high, let alone you want to add on top of that doing a conversation about something that's going to be risky for the business? Hell no, I think not. So I guess my point is that it sounds like what you're sort of not saying, but saying is that a culture needs to have high trust in order to engage in this agile approach that embraces risk.
I mean, it's kind of a catch-22 that you're exposing, right? It's like, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? I would say yes. In your best case scenario, you already work inside an organization that has really high levels of trust, the psychological safety to experiment and fail and try again. And I mean, what are those companies and are they hiring, right? Because we all want to work for them. I think the thing that I see more often, particularly as a facilitator who works with teams and groups, is that there is one leader who says, I am going to personally take on this risk to do work differently with my team in service of showing the rest of our organization that it can be done this way. So a lot of times I work with leaders who actually use working with me as their as their proof point, their first bit of evidence that we can bring the team together for purposeful work, for creative work. And it can also be something that builds culture and that moves our work forward. So yeah, I guess it's like a call to action, right? I mean, which leaders are ready to do that?
Right. And again, one begets the other. The one we're more successful in our innovative conversation, the more that builds trust. And the more that builds trust, the more that we're able to get into a more risky, innovative conversation. So I get the point that they're all happening, but I think that the point that you're also making is that they need to happen simultaneously. You can't just jump in and go, all right, you guys, we're going to have some risky conversations about where we're going to take the company, but we're not going to talk about our own interpersonal conversations because that's not what we were going to do, right? Yeah. It's similar to, I run into this all the time with strategic planning. This is a great little sidebar story. I was asked to come in to help socialize a brand new, shiny, very expensive, Accenture-built strategic plan for a large company up in Minneapolis. And we had 400 people that we were trying to get the strategic plan out to so they could understand what was written. So overall, it went pretty well. I was overall pretty happy with the results. But then the CEO pulled me aside later and said, so what'd you think? I mean, what are we missing here? And I said, hey, you got a $500,000 strategic plan. Looks great, right? You've got now all these people who sort of at least cognitively understand it. But, and here's the key part, you have a leadership team. Half of them are brand new to leadership at this level. Other two are not even been in the company for more than 6 months. If you want the strategic plan to actually implement, you're going to need to work on the team that's going to be in charge of making that happen. So this idea about simultaneously doing strategy with developing your team, or innovation and developing your team that's going to help the innovation happen, I think you can't separate them.
No, you kind of have to build the plane while you're flying it.
Exactly. And that's where I feel like we sometimes get very compartmentalized into the way in which we approach our businesses, and creating a silo approach. We're going to do strategic planning. We're now going to, we don't bring them together, because it's like a human body. It's organic. It's holistic. One begets the other, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because I hear this in so many different contexts. I hear this in organizations where they're like, we'd like to design a new way of working, but we're so entrenched in the ways we already do things, right? Or if you are a mid-career pivoter, right? And you're like, I really don't like the direction I'm going in. I wish I could just quit it all and start over, right? The interesting thing is, and I learned this actually very early on working at IDEO, this notion of constraints breeding creativity. So what I mean by that is that actually it can be very difficult to start with a clean slate, right? And so in the context of an organization, you don't have a clean slate. You have all these processes, you have all these ways of working, you have all these people already, right? In a job context, you've been working for 10, 20, maybe even 30 years already. You don't have a clean slate. You have financial responsibilities, you have family commitments. And actually, that's a good thing, which takes a minute to sort of wrap your head around that. But when you don't have just that open white space of starting fresh, when you say like, I need to make this amount of money, or I need to have this kind of schedule, or whatever that constraint might be, it actually gives you some safety. It gives you some guardrails to know what's in and what's out. And so I've come to really see, especially for people in midlife and mid-career who say, I'm unhappy with what I'm doing, but I can't possibly abandon everything because I have these constraints. I then immediately ask, well, how can these constraints actually serve as opportunities that guide you in your, designing the next chapter?
That's a really great point. I'm so glad you brought that up. It's something about the serendipity of this conversation is fascinating. We had some really good friends that came to visit us over the weekend, and he is a nationally known collected artist, very, very modern art kind of stuff, and I asked him, I said, so when you started your art journey, you were studying Russian Impressionists. You were studying the masters. Like, what was that about? And how did you transition into the kind of art that you're doing, which is so different? He goes, I needed to learn the constraints of art, color, design, contrast, light and dark, and all those things. Once I got that down, those constraints followed with me in my creative process. And I thought like, oh, so it goes right into what you're saying. We do this sometimes with time constraints. Like you give we have these little cubes, right? And you probably have seen them as a co-facilitator. You're in the tribe of facilitators, right? And the cube has different time on it, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. You turn it on and you say, you have to do this activity, this brainstorming activity for 10 minutes. And those of you who want to give up after 2, you have to continue to 10. And those of you who think you need more, you have to get it done in 10. And that time constraint does some amazing things for creativity. It pushes our brains into different parts of our thinking. New synapses start to fire because of that. I was one last quick story in this that's getting me thinking. I was asked to do did a coaching program for ExxonMobil many years ago. And at the end of the process, I said, hey, would you also coach some people one-on-one afterwards? And I said, sure. So people signed up and so forth. And I asked, how much time do I have? You have 30 minutes to coach a person you've never met before. And I went, what? I need at least, all this extra time. And like that constraint of time got me so focused and so creative. I said, all right, you guys, we don't have any time to BS. We got to get right to it. What's the one question you want to have answered by the time we walk out of here in 29 minutes? And lo and behold, Ashley, most of the time, if not almost all the time, they had some breakthrough, partly because of the constraints of time.
Yeah. Yeah. You remind me of, and I'm laughing because I don't exactly know, who this is, but in one group I was facilitating with, we often talked about what we called Parkinson's law. And I don't know who Parkinson is or was, but we talked about Parkinson's law being the idea that, the amount of time it takes to finish a task is the amount of time you give it. Right? So
Yes, so true.
if you have 30 minutes to coach, you accomplish that task in 30 minutes. If you have 3 hours to coach, you'll take 3 hours to do it.
No, it's so true. Yeah, I just looked it up on the internet. I guess it was developed in 1955. Yeah, exactly. If you give yourself a week to complete a task, it's going to take you a week.
Yep.
There's
Yep.
something about that. And like when people start thinking about, I often sometimes think when you go back to our original conversation, Ashley, about planning and design thinking and so forth, that this constraint of time, I think, is a tool
Mm.
to help aid in the process, because when we don't have that, like we go back to the meeting analogy, even we say, well, we could always kick it down the road to the next meeting. Now you've opened up and you don't have any constraints, right? But if you say, we cannot leave this meeting until we have this decided, and we're going to do it in 40 minutes, right? All of a
Yeah.
sudden you get to super focused on things. So I think this idea about constraints is very powerful when it comes to
Mm.
design. So well done on that.
Absolutely. I will offer, in terms of constraints and then picking back up on the idea of taking risks and being open to iteration. One of my most favorite constraints, actually, to use when, I'm working with people or teams who are ready to take action, but they don't know where to start,
Mm.
is actually asking a question, I learned from a mentor of mine, Lindy Dreyer, who says, what is the smallest, fastest, cheapest thing that I could do or try today to learn the most? So,
Hmm.
thinking about the smallest, fastest, cheapest thing I could do right now to learn the most. And that question, again, in the form of a constraint, is often super clarifying for people because it can't cost a lot of money. It can't involve a ton of people or a ton of resources. It has to be within, your own two hands, so to speak. And again, the goal is to learn what works or what doesn't.
I love it. It's like the quality of the question begets the quality of the answer. And sometimes we ask questions that have no constraints. How
Yeah.
are you today?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
well, I'm fine. So the quality of the question got a pretty poor, uh,
Hmm.
meh answer, right? But
Yeah.
what was the last dream that you remembered and what did it teach you about your life as a leader? Like all of a sudden they got
Oh,
constraints all
gosh.
over the place. And now you're like, oh my gosh, right? I want to ask you one other quick question here that is off topic a little bit. Because I know that you also, we talked about this before we started this recording, about your interest in intuition.
Mm.
And, when sometimes people think that intuition is something that if you're present and you're listening and you're breathing, maybe you might get some sort of pattern recognition that you could identify later as being intuitive. So intuition, I think, often has a definition of sort of an unplanned happening that
Mm.
just sort of takes place. But what I'm wondering is, can intuition be brought into life by design thinking, by creating a system for of constraints of which the output is some sort of intuitive insight? I'm not trying to put an engineer into an intuitive, like they almost feel like water and oil,
No.
but I don't think so. I think there are practices, but I want to know what your thoughts are about using design thinking as a way to create intuitive insights.
I love this question. And yes, absolutely. And here's the spin that I would put on it. So If I can tell a quick story.
Sure.
As I've shared, I've worked with some really incredible organizations, some amazing brands. I reached what I thought was really the pinnacle of my career. Like, if you can imagine me standing on the top of a mountain with my hands on my hips saying, like, I have arrived, everybody,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
And then I got laid off. And that was quite a blow. Although I've
Mm,
since learned there are so many incredible people who are members of the layoff club, as I like to call it. Um, and I just remember feeling like I had been given an opportunity. I
mm,
knew that I was going down a path in my career that, if I was really honest with myself, didn't feel fully aligned with who I am, even who I was at the time. And so what I decided to do, what I realized, was that having worked in innovation for so many years, I had some tools in my toolkit that, if again I could turn on myself and become like my own user, the person I'm designing for, that I might be able to kind of look at this problem of what's next through a different lens. And so in design thinking, I like to isolate it into four kind of distinct phases or parts of the process that you want to engage in. And they are actually, through the lens of your question, Dean, they are the perfect entry points for developing your own intuition, and learning to trust what your inner voice is telling you. So, in design thinking, there's an aspect that's about discovery, that's both looking out into the world to get inspiration and learn about what's going on, but is also, in the context of life and career design, is also about looking inward and starting
mm,
to ask questions and be curious about who I am as a person and where I am at this moment in my life. There's a part that's about defining what matters to you at this point in your life, which anyone who's ever, sat down and tried to hone their own intuitive knowing around what am I here to do and what's the opportunity for myself will kind of recognize define as a key part of that process.
mm,
Then there's imagining, right? Visioning, dreaming. Where am I going? What do I want my future to look like? And then there's iteration, which is about prototyping. It's about testing and experimenting. And in my experience, there is no better way to learn how to trust yourself than to go through that process and then actually have to take action and try something and stay with yourself and your inner knowing through that really vulnerable process. I mean, the whole thing is actually kind of geared towards honing your intuitive, knowing and skills, and like I said, self trust.
I love this. I've always thought that the a real engaged culture would allow for and encourage and celebrate the intuitive natures of their employees. Because if there is a person who is able to flex their intuition in a meeting with their peers,
Mm-hmm.
that then connotes to me that there's enough trust, there's enough ability to accept new ideas and explore risk. And if you can get a person who's really intuitive and they have a place at the table, the byproduct or essentially the foundation that created that was a very engaged organization. So I would love it at some point to have on some large organization's employee engagement survey a question that specifically relates to the ability and the safety in order to show up intuitively, not just analytically, but intuitively, to be able to see how that connects to overall engagement. Because the more and more I keep feeling this, that intuition is one of those superpowers of leaders, but we don't necessarily talk about it. It's something you sort of
Mm.
say, yeah, that was an intuitive decision, but I didn't say so, right? But when you ask them in private and you have coaching conversations with these people, they all say, yeah, the higher up I go, the more my intuition becomes important.
Yeah, yeah. I
Very
mean,
good.
you know, the It's interesting. What you're making me think of is like in the design thinking world, one of the things that one of the pieces of advice that actually early in my career I was given, and I can see the relevance for, is that if you're looking to hone your innovation skills and even kind of fluency, take some improv classes, right?
Yes,
Because being able to dance in the I'm just going to go for it, right? And
absolutely.
that's not that far from I was in a meeting and I just had an intuitive hit that what needed to be said was X or what needed to be tried was Y, right? They're very kind of close cousins, actually.
No, it's such a great, so my background was many years ago, I got my master's of fine arts in acting. And
Oh,
of
wow.
course, part of that was improvisation. And if you ever really want to start kind of exploring your intuitive nature, take some acting classes, take some improv classes. There was one guy I remember, he was working over at a large healthcare system, and he was struggling with his executive presence. And I said, why don't you go take an improv class? It's like, it was not what was in his mind at all. It was a very big stretch for him. But he really flourished. And not only did he flourish personally, but everybody else started noticing about how he
Mm.
was able to show up in a more authentic, creative, intuitive way that had a great benefit to the rest of the company. So this is fun. So Ashley, tell our studio audience, which is not really a studio, where can they follow you, find out more about you, connect with you if they would like?
Absolutely. So I'm very active on LinkedIn. So you can find me there. I would love to connect with any listeners there. You can also visit my website, wayfinderscollective.com. There's
Mm.
all sorts of information about coaching, about facilitation. And I guess I would also add a side project that actually, Dean, I've been sort of following my own intuition. It's leading me down unexpected paths.
Mm.
I've recently launched a new kind of creative project called Life Design School, which I think of as really a creative sandbox for people who are exploring what's next for their careers and lives and looking for resources to support them as they design them. So, on demand workshops, reflection journals, additional kind of resources and tools. You can find all of that at lifedesignschool.co.
That sounds great. So I'm gonna steal from another podcaster the final question that I'm gonna ask you. I think that I don't watch it all the time, but Stephen Bartlett has obviously gotten very popular with his podcast called The Diary of a CEO. And I think how he does it, and I don't know whether this is a common thing for him or not, but I remember him doing it once. He asked the guest to come up with a question that the next guest would have to answer. I thought that's not bad. So could you finish off this conversation with a question that I could ask? And I don't even know who my next interview is. I don't know. I haven't even looked at my calendar. I know it's sometime this week I've got to interview somebody else, and I'll do my research and all that kind of stuff. But what is a great question that I could ask this person that comes from you?
Hmm. Oh my God, what a thoughtful and interesting question.
Talk about paying it
Um,
forward.
Really paying it forward.
Yeah.
So I have been asked so many questions that have really stood out in my mind.
Give us one.
Um, so the one that I'm gonna share back to you with a tiny bit of context. The question is, what was your very first question? And I
Oh,
get that
interesting.
question from an author named Courtney Martin, who actually, if you Google her, I think you can see like Courtney Martin first question. You can see an article that describes it. But the framing is that each of us is born asking a question that becomes the through line of our lives. So the question shows up in slightly different forms, right? Different vocabulary, different
Yeah.
expressions. But it is the question that you as a human keep asking over and over and over again. And that's something I've been really curious about for myself. And so I would offer that to the next guest and hope that they like it.
Ashley, beautiful question. Nice way to to close this out. I really appreciate that. Very, very done. Well done.
Absolutely.
If you found value in today's conversation, please take a moment to rate and review our show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It helps more people discover Leadervation and this kind of conversation. And if you're looking to strengthen leadership, culture, or team performance in your organization, you can learn more about working with me and Mission Facilitators International at mfileadership.com.